somebody had brought up sort of the differences between Silicon Valley and New York. I think New York's come a long way in tech for sure, but there's still like a risk appetite gap in New York versus San Francisco, in that, San Francisco, you see the biggest valuations, you see, like in terms of PR kind of, presence on TechCrunch, et cetera, like those tend to be dominated by Silicon Valley names. And that's not to say that New York can't continue growing itself, but there is a bit of gap. And I think it's partly cultural, because New York's roots, even within venture capital, is kind of a lot of ex-bankers who've kind of, they're fed up with like work in the big banks. Maybe they made some money and now they've got their own funds. But there's still a little bit of that, banker framework in terms of thinking about, investing even at the early stage. Whereas, I think when I think of Silicon Valley, you see more moonshots. So, I think the New York ecosystem will continue to get better, because there are a lot of engineers here. Over the last couple of years, there's been quite an increase in the number of like coding boot camps for people who were not, they didn't code before. Maybe they didn't study computer science, but now they're interested in becoming programmers. So there's a lot of that. From a VC standpoint, there are probably more funds in New York now than there have ever been before. So as long as and also I think New York is so entrepreneurial in terms of its culture. Like, it's definitely one of these, it's a very like hustle and bustle type city, but you have a lot of aspirational people here. So I think you combine that with sort of the, I think just the increased focus in tech. You have, what's that? The Cornell campus that's upcoming as well. I think there's a long runway ahead for New York, but in terms of like maybe what New York is missing, maybe there's a little bit of a gap in terms of just total risk appetite, between us and the West Coast.
Yeah, there's definitely.
That's my impression. Yeah, it's not scientific. I'm just.
No, I agree. There's definitely a blurring of the lines, but at the extreme, right? New York and the East Coast is a little bit more institutional in fintech nature, and the West Coast is a little bit more individual. This is a panel about the future of fintech. I think infrastructure has got a long way to go, and that's going to be driven primarily out of this marketplace. Intelligence is another big driver of fintech in the next few years, and I think you used to argue that would come out of Silicon Valley, but I think you're starting to see the applied to financial services out here, so that's a little bit of a mix. And then technology that's being applied for financial services to the individual, the consumer, is still being much more done out of the West Coast. So I think it really depends on where you see the bigger kind of drivers for the future. But I think that's why there's a little bit of an equilibrium between both markets at the moment, and I think it'll largely continue that way.
I just want to add quickly that I think there is a bottleneck in the capital ecosystem in New York. I think we've seen, and I kind of started with this introducing my own fund, that there's been this proliferation of seed players. And we have so many more funds in New York, but they're very much in that very early stage. At Series A and beyond, we don't really have a lot of players. There's probably, you can count them up relatively easily, but these are mostly multi-stage venture capital funds that just established a New York presence now, but they're not necessarily focused on the stage. While at the seed stage, you just have enormous opportunities to engage in a conversation. So I think we need more of that. As this ecosystem is growing up, to support that, you need a lot more capital.